So, have you ever heard of a year where summer just never showed up? I'm talking about a time of snow in June, of constant, gloomy skies, and a world that was suddenly plunged into a mysterious, bitter cold. And no, this isn't some sci fi story. This is the incredible, true story of the year a volcano on the other side of the planet literally stole summer. Now, people back then had absolutely no idea what was going on, but they came up with some pretty unforgettable names for it. In the US, 1816 became known as the Poverty Year, or even more chillingly, 1800 and froze to death. I mean, that nickname just perfectly captures the kind of misery that was unfolding. And trust me, this was no exaggeration. The weather across the entire Northern Hemisphere just went completely haywire. Can you imagine waking up to snow in Albany, New York in June? Or having a hard frost kill your crops in Virginia in late August? Over in Europe, they were drowning in nonstop rain while places like Italy and Hungary saw this bizarre red and brown snow falling from the sky. And in the US, a strange dry fog just hung in the air, dimming the sun. Get this, one doctor in New Hampshire actually recorded foot-long icicles still hanging around in the shade at noon. So, naturally, the big question on everyone's mind was, what on earth was happening? You have to remember, with no global communication, people were just terrified and confused. The answer, though, was thousands of miles away, on the complete opposite side of the planet. Okay, so the cause wasn't supernatural, it was geological. A single, absolutely massive volcanic eruption had cast a shadow that would literally wrap around the globe and change the course of history. Now, what's really interesting here is that the atmosphere was already kind of primed for a disaster. You see, there were a couple of other pretty significant volcanic eruptions in 1812 and 1814 that had already pumped a bunch of dust into the air. But then, in April of 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia just unleashed an explosion unlike anything in recorded history. It was the big one. To give you some sense of the scale here, scientists use something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. Tambora's eruption was a VEI 7. Let me be clear, this is the most powerful eruption modern humans have ever actually witnessed and written down. It's off the charts. The eruption blasted a staggering 37 cubic kilometers of ash, dust, and rock straight up into the atmosphere. The heavy stuff, well, it fell back down, burying nearby towns and creating these weird floating mats of ash on the ocean. But the really fine, light particles, they just kept going up. And once those tiny particles reached the stratosphere way up high, they spread out, forming this massive aerosol cloud. This cloud basically acted like a giant sunshade for the planet, blocking sunlight and causing the Earth's average temperature to drop by about 1 degree Celsius, or almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but as we're about to see, the consequences were absolutely catastrophic. This whole phenomenon actually has a name. It's called a volcanic winter. Essentially, the volcano creates its own global shade, this veil of aerosols high up in the atmosphere that stops the sun's warmth from getting to the ground. And that is exactly what the world was living through in 1816. So what did this volcanic winter actually mean for the people on the ground? Well, this wasn't just some weird weather. It was a full-blown global humanitarian crisis. The dark sky and the cold temperatures had this devastating domino effect on societies all around the world. And absolutely no one was spared. In Europe, which was already recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, it triggered the worst famine of the entire 19th century. We're talking food riots, deadly typhus epidemics. In North America, crops failed all over New England. Food prices went through the roof, and families started moving west just to survive. And in Asia, a disrupted monsoon in India helped spread cholera all the way to Moscow, while China suffered from massive floods and famine. It was a truly global disaster. This first-hand account from a doctor in New Hampshire it really brings it home. He was writing in August, what should have been the peak of the harvest, and he said the fields were as empty and white as October because the frost had already killed all his corn and beans. Just devastating. But here's where the story takes this really fascinating turn, because out of all that darkness and gloom and suffering came this surprisingly powerful and lasting legacy of human creativity and innovation. It's an incredible example of how a crisis can actually spark profound change. Okay, so picture this. It's the quote-unquote summer of 1816 at Lake Geneva in Switzerland.
You've got this group of brilliant young English writers on holiday, but they're stuck inside day after day because of the incessant rainfall and gloomy skies. So, to pass the time, they came up with a challenge. Who could write the best ghost story?
One of those writers was the famous poet Lord Byron. He just channeled that apocalyptic feeling of the year into his incredible poem Darkness, capturing this feeling of a world where the sun had basically just been switched off. It was a direct artistic response to the volcanic winter.
And you know who else was at that gloomy holiday? An 18-year-old named Mary Shelley. Inspired by the bleak weather and all these late-night spooky conversations, she had a waking dream that would become one of the most famous horror stories of all time, Frankenstein, a literary masterpiece born directly from the year without a summer. How wild is that?
But the impact wasn't just in art. The crisis also fueled invention. The massive failure of oat crops made feeding horses, the main way people got around, insanely expensive. So this very practical problem inspired a German inventor, Karl Dreis, to create a solution, a way to travel without a horse. And his invention, the Draisine, was the world's very first bicycle.
And the effects just kept rippling outwards. Artists like J.M.W. Turner became famous for painting these spectacular, hazy, yellowish sunsets, which were caused by all the ash in the atmosphere. In America, the disaster kicked off this huge wave of migration, with families fleeing the failed farms of New England. And one of those families that left Vermont for New York was that of a young Joseph Smith, a move that would be pivotal in the founding of the Mormon Church.
So you might be thinking, why does a bizarre weather event from over 200 years ago still matter to us? Well, because it's like this powerful, sobering echo from the past, and it holds some really critical lessons for our own time. When you really break it down, the warning is crystal clear. First, we saw how a seemingly tiny temperature drop, just 1 degree Celsius, was enough to cause worldwide devastation. Second, this event just threw a spotlight on how incredibly fragile our global food and social systems really are. And finally, 1816 is a real historical case study of what happens when the climate shifts, fast and without warning. Which leaves us with a final, pretty heavy question. The year without a summer was a temporary climate change event caused by nature. As we now face a potentially permanent, human-driven change, is this story a warning? A glimpse from history of the profound impact that just a few degrees of change can really have? If you found this story as fascinating as I did, you should definitely check out the other explainers in our Unusual History Events playlist. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to Notebook Summaries for more deep dives into incredible topics like this one. Thanks so much for watching.